evening and welcome to our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight, we are excited to have author Dr. Cecily Zander with us to discuss her book, The Army Under Fire, The Politics of Antimilitarism. No, I was going to trip on that. The Politics of Antimilitarism in the Civil War Era. This book focuses on the political debates over the size and use of America's armed forces that occurred as the nation was immersed in brutal internecine warfare. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I am the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation's purpose is to support, sustain, and provide educational and public programming, research, and access to historic places and collections related to the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln in cooperation with other entities. Our vision is the global protection and expansion of freedom and democracy inspired by the life and work of President Abraham Lincoln. For more information on how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd just like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being with us for the first Fourscore Speaker Series program of 2025. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Cecily Zander to discuss her new book, The Army Under Fire, The Politics of Antimilitarism in the Civil War Era. Dr. Cecily Zander is currently an assistant professor of history at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, and a senior fellow at Southern Methodist University's Center for Presidential History, where she previously held a postdoctoral fellowship. Next year, fall 2025, she will move to the University of Wyoming, where she will teach the Civil War era in the American West. She also serves as chief historian for Emerging Civil War, a popular website for accessible writing about the Civil War era. She received her PhD at the Pennsylvania State University in 2021, her MA also at Penn State in 2017, and her BA from the University of Virginia in 2015. Her first book, The Army Under Fire, The Politics of Antimilitarism in the Civil War Era, was published by Louisiana State University Press in 2024. She's currently working on her second book, A History of Abraham Lincoln and the American West, to be published by Liverite. Cecily, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. To kick things off, could you tell us a bit about your career arc? What led you to a career in history?
Sure. Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks to Phyllis and everyone at the foundation. Super excited to be here. Why did I become a historian? My parents asked themselves that, I think, every day. They were a nurse and a math teacher before they retired, so it was not a kind of preordained path for me, but I spent my childhood traveling across the Great Plains. I grew up in Colorado, but my family's from Wyoming, or from North Dakota, so we would spend time in Wyoming and South Dakota, visiting historic sites as we made our summer road trips. And I think mainly because they were very inexpensive and had publicly accessible restrooms, which is great when you're traveling with small kids. But I just got enchanted by these like physical pieces of history on the landscape that you could visit them and you could see them. And a lot of it's about the 19th century and a lot of it's about the Army. The Great Plains were one of the most heavily militarized zones in our country's history as the nation moved west. In the decade before the Civil War, but mainly in the decades that followed the conflict. And I learned a certain narrative about Civil War history and the professional army visiting those sites. And then I came east to go to college. I studied Civil War history at the University of Virginia. You basically had a choice there. It was either Jefferson or the Civil War, and I opted for the Civil War. And I was most interested in it because I knew a lot of the main characters, the principal players, but I knew them from their post-war careers in the West. And I wanted to find out just what they'd been doing before they all went out to the Great Plains. And when I got to my PhD program, I think it's inevitable for folks to want to write about where they came from. And for me, there was a very sort of ready and present question in the difference between these two narratives. This narrative of a very difficult and tough life in the Army in the West after the Civil War, and a narrative of the ways in which the Civil War made the nation's military stronger and greater than ever. So I really wanted to investigate those points of difference and why those two narratives from two different kind of fields, two different historiographies are so different, which led me to my dissertation, which ultimately became my first book.
So what I guess then prompted you to write this book now? What really drove that?
Yeah, so I think it's an important question in the 21st century. Having grown up in a generation that has not known really until very recently a time when the United States was not at war. I have grown up in an era in which there's pretty strident pro-militarism. There's really no question year to year whether the Army's budget is going to get approved, whether the president or Congress are going to be in favor of the Army or in favor of war. And I found out in the 19th century that was really not true at all. It was much more contested. And the Army's very existence on a year-to-year basis was often hanging by a thread. And we don't often think about that with the Civil War. It surprises people that there was anti-militarism in the Civil War era, because it seems like the one time in our nation's history that everybody was pretty on board with the whole concept of saving the Union and ending slavery. But it was a time of strident debate over the Army and its place in American public life, a debate that I don't think we see as often as maybe we ought to in the present day. And so, I hope the book gets people to think about the ways in which the Army's future, even though it seems eminently secure to us, hasn't always been that secure.
Well, and I certainly learned so much and got so many new perspectives out of your book. And those are my favorite kind of books to read, to be totally honest. And I know that our audience often feels the same way when we have these, authors on like you who are bringing completely new insights to topics that we thought we really understood because of the existing scholarship and canon that's out there. Can you define for our audience, and you do this so well in the book, what you mean by, pro-military, anti-military, what do you mean by anti-militarism as you describe it in the 19th century US? What does that mean in the context of this book?
Sure, it's a great question. And I went around and around with my editors and publisher about whether to use it at all. This is Mo for the audience. He likes to partake in these seminars. Anti-militarism to the 19th century sort of American really meant an opposition to the professional army. So the United States evolved what historians kind of refer to as a dual military tradition. We have a small professional army that is mandated in the Constitution. The checks and balances of that document give Congress the right to declare war and fund the army and raise it, but the president, as commander-in-chief, is the kind of overseer of that military. It was kept small by the founding fathers because standing armies and democratic republics don't tend to get along very well. In human history, we have plenty of examples of standing professional armies overturning democracies. Our founding fathers wanted to avoid that. So they compromised, created a small standing army that would provide a skeleton around which a large volunteer force would expand in a time of war. And so we have these two traditions, and Americans love our volunteer army. We're always behind the volunteers, and this is as true in the Civil War era as in any other conflict. But we always remain innately suspicious of the professional army, and especially of its officer class, educated at West Point, who strike many Americans as aristocratic, perhaps obscure. Certainly the kind of martinet figure that we see often reviled in soldiers' letters from the Civil War home, talking about the mean officer who made them do their drills and clean their shoes. And they don't like them very much. And so anti-militarism is about this professional army and both the existential and potentially sort of present threat that it poses to the maintenance of a democratic republic. And so anti-militarism in the Civil War era is really, as I define it, opposition to the professional army and especially to its expansion during the conflict.
Okay, so given that was part of the founding, that the founders were thinking about that, and that is essentially, it seems like a pervasive feeling or sentiment. Who's joining? Who's going to West Point?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's often sort of younger sons who don't get the family support to go to the Harvards and the Ivy Leagues, or perhaps know they're not going to inherit the family business or the plantation, but need a career and a job. And this is some kind of remnant of America's kind of English heritage and an attempt to be like other European nations where a military appointment and officership was nothing to be looked down upon. But yeah, it was often the province of these maybe second and third sons. But the other people who go to West Point or seek these appointments are folks who are interested in an engineering education. In the 19th century, there's no better school to go to learn how to be an engineer, to be a surveyor, to kind of help the country move west, which is really the Army's primary job for most of the 19th century. And so many guys go to West Point because it's a free education. You do a 5-year course of study. Only 1 year of that is tactics or strategy. The rest of the time, you're getting a fairly well-rounded, very liberal education with a special focus on engineering. You do your 5 years of mandatory service, and then you get out and get a nice cushy job overseeing one of the railroads that's rapidly expanding across the Northeast or Pennsylvania, and you have a pretty good life for yourself. So those are the kind of folks who are eyeing West Point as a career opportunity, but they know that there's going to be kind of quite a bit of resentment from the general American populace when they see an officer in the street, but they're willing to bear that for the dividends, I think, the education, tended to pay as they went through their careers.
Okay. How about the Army regulars? What about the people who are enlisting for careers in the Army?
In the ranks, yeah, that's a very different kind of cohort of individuals. So it's not dissimilar to European armies that maybe compel military service. It tends to be folks either recently arrived from all over the world who are looking for a ticket west or a way to get on their feet in a new country, maybe don't even speak English, maybe it's a way to learn English, it's a path to citizenship as well. So about 50% of the Army over the course of this period are recently arrived immigrants, not even American citizens. And then other times it's folks who perhaps don't have a high degree of education, perhaps are unskilled or would otherwise be unskilled laborers or workers, or folks looking for a way to get west. And they're willing to, again, sort of, in a way, indenture themselves to this institution for 4 or 5 years as a way of getting where they want to go without, the means to do so under their own steam.
Okay. We have a question from the audience, Cecily, that's relevant to this discussion too about anti-militarism. And they ask, is it anti-militarism or a time before people could conceive of a larger, more powerful government? Because they said for them personally, anti-militarism evokes pacifism, nonviolence, Quakers.
Sure, I think that's a very fair reading of the word, which is why I take a lot of time to define it in the introduction to try and sketch out what I mean by it. I was never going to be able to come up with a perfect word without sort of repeatedly typing the phrase opposition to the professional standing army in my book, and it would have been 4 times as long as a result. So I used it as shorthand, but I think that's true. Although I do think there is a sense of sort of anti-militarism in the United States because they can compare themselves to every European nation which compels military service from its citizens. And the United States Army is never more than 10% of even the smallest European countries. And in terms of like land size to soldier ratio, Britain, France, all of these countries have 1 soldier for every 1/10 of a square mile. And the United States might have 1 soldier for every 12 square miles. And so we really don't have a large army, at least as compared to the nations that the United States sort of compares itself to in terms of its culture and its world standing.
Okay. Carol also, here's another, Carol has 2 questions actually. One important one, which is how old is Mo? Because she's watching with her favorite feline, Ginny.
Mo will be turning 5 in 10 days.
Outstanding. Well, happy birthday to Mo. But her second question is about how did young men qualify for West Point? What was the process? And as an aside to this for the audience, the way this book is organized was also really enjoyable to me. You have these interludes, and one of the interludes is about someone who qualified for West Point, Jefferson Davis. So if you could maybe answer that question, and then, if you will, talk a little bit about Jefferson Davis and his time at West Point.
Sure. Yeah, Davis is a great example of someone who was using the Army as a means to another career, and in particular because he was the second son and his older brother was going to inherit the family plantation. Though Davis did just fine, he goes on to be one of the 5 largest slaveholders in the country by the time of the Civil War, which is, I think, part of the reason they made him the president of the Confederacy. But he gets an appointment from his state senator. Or you could go through the Secretary of War. Each senator is allowed to appoint 1 cadet from their state. So 2 cadets from each state are appointed by the state's 2 senators. And then you can also write letters to the Secretary of War to try and get an appointment. And so John C. Calhoun, who's the Secretary of War, when Jefferson Davis becomes eligible to go to West Point, gives Davis his appointment. And Davis does go to West Point. He does not like it. He does not take well to it. We all have our kind of visions of who Jefferson Davis is as a person. He was quite irascible, did not have the temperament to submit to what others wanted, and this made him difficult to get along with. It compromised, I believe, many of his ability really to be a very good president of the Confederacy. He always wanted to meddle in military affairs in a way that Lincoln never did, because he had a West Point background, whereas Lincoln thought, I'm going to leave this to the officers and just try to learn what I can. Davis doesn't like that West Point makes Northern and Southern cadets equal and puts them on an equal playing field, because he comes in with a strong belief that Southern cadets, or the cadets from Southern states, are much stronger candidates to be great soldiers. And so he really chafes against the kind of melting pot that West Point forces the cadets from all over the country to become. But he does receive that appointment from John C. Calhoun. He submits to his program at West Point, graduates in a middling kind of station in his class. He had plenty of demerits for misbehavior. He liked to go to the bar over the hill and spend time there instead of studying, which was not smiled upon at West Point. And then he does serve his years in the Army and gets out as soon as he can. He actually marries the daughter of his first commanding officer, a man by the name of Zachary Taylor, who will go on to be president. He marries Taylor's daughter. She dies about 3 months after their wedding, very unfortunately. And Davis is single for a while and then goes on to marry Verena Howell. But he does sort of do his best in the Army. He serves in Florida in the Second Seminole War, but he gets out as soon as he can back to his kind of plantation lifestyle, and then a career in politics. And he will go on to become, funnily enough, Secretary of War during the presidency of Franklin Pierce.
Okay. And you laid out with, and there are, if you like data, this is also a good book for you, because there are really cool tables of data that just lay things out really plainly. As Secretary of War, there's a buildup of the Army, the professional standing Army, and Davis and Pierce also start using the Army in a way that provokes more anti-militarism and becomes part of the Republican Party's platform. Unofficially, it's tied to the anti-slavery sentiment. So can you talk about what the differences were and how either the parties or sectional differences in the view of the military, and how that shifted or was exacerbated by what Secretary Davis and President Pierce were doing, especially with regard to Kansas?
Yeah, so the crisis in Kansas is really the flashpoint that I base a lot of my analysis on. Really, before the 1850s, both parties, that is the Whigs and the Democrats, were fairly consistent on voting for military issues, like in favor of them. It tended to be less about politics and more about whether you got your certain slice of pork fat into the legislation. Like year to year, there wasn't a lot of consistency. But going into the 1850s, the Army becomes a partisan issue, and Democrats, and in particular their most vociferous leaders, the Southern Democrats, that wing of the party, become the pro-Army party. And as the Whig Party kind of breaks down and the Republican Party begins to form in response to the Kansas crisis, they start to argue that not only is the slave power kind of extant and exerting undue influence over the federal government, they're also using the Army to do their bidding in making the West a space that is welcoming to slavery. And so you start to get major Republican figures like William Henry Seward and Charles Sumner arguing frequently that Jefferson Davis and Franklin Pierce are deploying the United States Army, which the taxpayers fund and which is supposed to represent the nation as a whole, in a way to benefit Southern interests. And the most famous example of this is that Pierce and Davis elect to send in a regiment of United States troops to break up a Free State meeting at Topeka, Kansas on the 4th of July in 1854, which is dispersed at the point of a bayonet. And so what Sumner and Seward and eventually Lincoln will all be saying is that the Army is being used as an instrument of pro-slavery influence, and the Army therefore cannot be trusted. And this is going to be a real problem because within the next 5 years, sort of following this crisis, the Republican Party is not only going to be in really sole charge of the army as holding the presidency and control of Congress, they're going to have to rely on the soldiers of that army to help them win a civil war. And that trust and that ability to trust professional soldiers is really never repaired after the crisis in Kansas.
Can you also, for the audience, put the context of what happened in Kansas to how Davis was using the army throughout the Southwest?
Yeah, so Davis achieves as Secretary of War something that was probably unthinkable to the founding generation. He actually gets a 4-regiment increase of the regular army passed through Congress. This adds 4,000 men to an army that had never really surpassed about 10,000 troops before. He gets the numbers up to 14,000, about 16,000 with kind of all the ancillary attachments. And so it's a massive increase. He then immediately deploys 1/5 of that army to Texas. I live in Texas. It's big, but it's not 1/5 of the country, right? And he deploys them also to New Mexico and Arizona, which if you think about the Missouri Compromise line, which is supposed to dictate where slavery can and cannot go in the West, or the 2 territories left open remaining to slave expansion. He sends another 1/5 of the army to New Mexico and Arizona. So you have 2/5 of the army, 40% of the army is in territory open to slaveholding. Another 1/5 is on the sea coast. They're not doing sort of anything related to sort of the internal Western expansion service. Davis is really kind of shifting and moving troops in a way to benefit slaveholding expansion. He invests more money and more troops in surveying the line of a potential Southern Trans-Pacific Railroad route, and then forwards that survey to Congress so it reaches their desks first so that they'll consider it above sort of a middle or northern route across the West. He's doing all kinds of really kind of quiet little things to make the Southwest and the potential pro-slavery territory of the region look more appealing to a national audience. And the Republicans at this point, after watching the slave power control national politics for the better part of 2 decades, have grown pretty tired of it, and they begin to call him out for it.
Okay. And they call him out for this with regard to the incident in Kansas. And I thought it was fascinating in your book that the Colonel Sumner, who was the one who was in charge of the regulars in that incident, that Davis and Pierce kind of throw him under the bus. Can you talk about that incident? Like, why would they, if it was so clear that this was what they were doing, and you have some Southern pro-slavery politicians even laying it out, being very clear that this is what's happening, why back off from it? Why was that incident in particular, and the Anthony Burns case related to the Fugitive Slave Act, why were those cases in particular maybe flashpoints where Davis, even if he was, even if it was clear to everyone what was happening, why are those in particular sort of things that he wants to scapegoat to someone like a Colonel Sumner?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think because he knows that an army officer has no recourse when the Secretary of War blames him for something. Like Davis, if he accepted the blame for himself, could get in trouble. He could lose his secretaryship, theoretically. I don't think they would have taken it away from him. But soldiers don't really have a choice because of the way our military system is set up. Soldiers have to respond to the authority figure, and the Secretary of War is really at the head of the army. And so Sumner can't argue back, or else he'll risk losing his position. And as a colonel in the antebellum army, that's about the highest rank you could hope to achieve. Promotion was very, very slow in this institution. Colonel, the rank right below your sort of various ranks of generals. So Sumner had achieved what he probably believed was the peak of his career, and arguing back publicly against the Secretary of War was going to do him no favors within the institution. Professional army officers viewed themselves as apolitical. Whether they were or not was sort of irrelevant, but they had to serve whether it was a Democrat, a Whig, a Republican, a Federalist in power. And so they couldn't be making political comments or political arguments, or else they risk losing their job. Or when the new administration came in, their head was on the chopping block. And so Sumner can't argue back. And Davis, as a former officer, knows that. And he knows that an officer doesn't have much choice. And so right? This is the classic tactic of the slave power. They deny that that's what's going on, and they say, "Oh, it's just a conspiracy. You're making all of this up." I was talking to my students today about Alexander Stephens and his cornerstone speech, "Slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy." And when they asked Stephens about it after the war, he said, "Well, no, that's not what I meant." Well, no, it's clear that's what you meant, but this is a kind of a classic tactic of the slave power to deny kind of what is actually going on behind the scenes.
You mentioned speeches Charles Sumner gave, and I have to say that it's kind of a lot of what you cover in the book. It's like refocusing a lens on something you thought you knew, and the names in this book are going to be familiar to a lot of people in the audience. You provide examples of politicians like Benjamin Stanton of Ohio, Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, Joshua Giddings of Ohio, others who are pointing to the Burns case and what happened with the anti-slavery legislature in Kansas as examples of Democrats abusing the power of government. Even warning, Stanton warns, quote, this would lead, or that it would lead to the army shooting peaceful citizens, that was a concern that they were having. So they're not in the majority, so it seems like there's very little they could do about it legislatively before the Civil War, when they then have a majority, because a lot of their colleagues have left. But how did the press react to what was happening? Certainly the press, partisanship was more obvious. You very helpfully provide some examples of press that aren't explicitly, Democrat or Republican, but how is the press reacting to all this?
They start to really take note. I think the army is the kind of one issue around which even the partisan press starts to say something's a little weird here, like something's going on. When Sumner, and they are cousins, it's really funny. So Edwin Vose Sumner, the army colonel, is a cousin of Charles Sumner. And one newspaper rudely comments that one of them got all the brains the family had to give, and it wasn't the army officer. So, but a newspaper reporter apparently wrote up to Sumner after he dismissed the legislature and said, Colonel Sumner, you've robbed Oliver Cromwell of his laurels. The army did not get away with a lot when it came to the press, but the newspapers did sort of start to point this out, like something's really going on in the West. This is where the country's sort of laser focused. I mean, the Civil War in many ways is a war about the future of the West. It's a war to decide what the region is going to look like, and everyone knows that, and the main question there is slavery. The main institution that handles the conquest of the West is the army. So therefore, you cannot separate the army from the issue of slavery. And this is what Republicans latch onto and the press latches onto. There's something going on there. There has to be a relationship between the professional military, Western expansion, and slavery.
So then with the Civil War breaking out, and they feel like they have some more evidence of this, especially when you have West Pointers, any West Pointers who are disloyal and then go to serve for the Confederacy. But as you pointed out, now there's a Civil War. We have some audience questions that I'll be dragging in here because they're about, okay, now the Civil War is happening. As you know, now you have to rely on the army. Certainly there are a lot of volunteers, but in what ways did the anti-military politics of Republicans who are now in power at that point during the Civil War influence Union military strategy and decisions during the war?
So yeah, they decide, they being the politicians in Washington and in Congress, decide that they know better than every man who received his education at their expense at West Point. So I write about this in a couple of different ways. One way we can really look at sort of the presence of anti-militarism during the war is just a simple breakdown of numbers and data. And I do apologize. I know folks don't come to history books for tables and charts, but
I do, Cecily. You got your
right. They were born out of my own sort of, I kept having to look up the same things, and I was finally like, I'm going to make a chart. And then once I made the chart, I was like, I'm going to put the chart in the book because it took me hours because I'm not good at spreadsheets. I'm a historian. So they're in the book. They're sort of my crowning achievement. But if you look at the numbers, the sort of sheer data, about 1.2 million men serve in Union armies. We know that coming into the Civil War, the regular army was 16 regiments, that is 16,000 men, a regiment being on paper about 1,000 men. At the end of the war, the size of the professional army, the regular army, which was never disbanded and also never incorporated with the volunteer army, was 25,000 men. They added 9 regiments. So only 25,000 out of the 1.2 million men who served in the Civil War are in professional army regiments. And then they immediately turn their attention after the war to seeing if they can shrink that number, because even the 9 additional regiments were added begrudgingly. They really did not want them added or tacked on to the federal budget. And they also didn't want those professional soldiers mixing in with the volunteers. They were kept separate. It makes sense to us, and people often ask this question: why didn't the regular army just get mixed in? Don't you want that expertise to kind of spread around to all these volunteers, these raw recruits? No, because the regular army was judged to be too dangerous, too much of a political hot potato. They couldn't have professional troops intermingling. Now, officers are a different question. You do need trained officers to lead a war, but 300 of those officers decided to commit treason, and the rest are suspicious by association. And so congressional speeches are just filled with these harangues against professional officers. And you even have people like a guy by the name of John Sherman, who's standing up in front of Congress. He's a senator from Ohio, saying things like, I just don't think these West Point trained officers have what it takes to win this war. And I imagine his brother, William Tecumseh Sherman, opened the newspaper the next day and said, well, thanks a lot, bro. I'm doing my best. I mean, it's down to that level. I mean, these guys grew up together. They are brothers. And because of politics, John Sherman feels comfortable saying his brother, who will be one of the 3 most important soldiers in the war, who will contribute more to Union victory than almost anyone else, probably doesn't have what it takes because he went to West Point. So there's also that kind of rhetoric that goes on. And then there's also an attempt at oversight, which comes in the form of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which I write a little bit about, but this is an institution, a joint committee founded by several radicals, among them Benjamin Wade, to try and haul up Army officers in front of congressional panels and then explain to them in excruciating detail why they waged battles poorly. Essentially all of us around the water cooler on Monday morning after the big football game saying, well, if I was Elway, I just don't think I would have thrown that pass. That is what these folks are saying about the professional military. They are wasting the time of these officers and accusing them throughout of being conservative with a lowercase c, trying to drag out this war for their own benefit and telling them that they need to be more aggressive. Of course, these guys who are saying this, these Benjamin Wades, they have no idea what it takes to be aggressive on the battlefield, but they certainly feel comfortable publishing 1,000-page reports about why they think the professional army isn't doing its job properly.
Yeah, it's such a cliche to say that the Civil War was pitting brother against brother, and usually we're thinking that in terms of the Confederacy versus the Union. But the fact that you had the example of the Sherman brothers in there just shows that it's even across, ideological divides or political versus military divides during the Civil War. So Dave in our audience wants to know, as the Civil War, and you spoke to this a little bit, but his question is related but slightly different. As the Civil War dragged on, did Americans not see the value of a professional army helping to bring the war to a conclusion?
They really don't. They really try to shine a light on the organic kind of volunteer officers who rise from the ranks. And so men like John Logan become national heroes because they are not professional soldiers. They are volunteers who just show this innate military ability. And you get the Wades of the kind of government saying things like, there are going to be great soldiers that come out of the ranks of the volunteers. And that's what we really want to foster. And they do actually write that into national legislation in 1862 when they passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which establishes the nation's land grant universities. So for the most part, your A&Ms and your states across the country. So like a Michigan state, for example, those universities are supposed to focus on agriculture and sort of maybe not classical education, but practical education. But they also in 1862 have written into their provisions that they need to provide a military education to their students. And the idea behind this is that in the next Great War, you will have a population of volunteers who have also received a military education, but not in the strict aristocratic West Point sense, in the egalitarian sort of public good sense, and they can be the next great officers. And so they're also trying to undermine West Point through avenues that we wouldn't typically expect, but one of them is education. So they want officers to rise from the ranks. And And it's going to work to some extent. Nelson Miles, who will go on to be the general of the army at the end of the 19th century, is one such volunteer. He begins the Civil War as a 20-something sort of young man who rises through the ranks and will go on to be general of the army. But he's one of the first from amongst the ranks of volunteers to do so. But that's the vision that the Republicans are after. They're after that volunteer vision. And we know, right, that these volunteer officers and the West Point guys also don't get along. If you just want to enjoy one of the biggest cat fights in Civil War history, you can read the correspondence of John Logan and William Tecumseh Sherman. Those two guys were not friends. And John Logan, when he became one of the most important senators in the country during Reconstruction, would frequently get up and give speeches about why he thought the general of the army, William Tecumseh Sherman's salary, should be reduced on an almost weekly basis. He just kind of made it his hobby horse.
Yeah. So, and that was news to me that Logan was so that distinction of being anti-professional military really is important. I always think of John Logan, one of the founders of Memorial Day, certainly a champion of veterans and recognition and pensions and things like that. But for that was one of the eye-opening things about your book here. So how did perceptions about the military change after post-Civil War demobilization? And what effect did Reconstruction have on those perceptions?
Yeah, it's pretty ironic. So we talked about the Army had one real friend, and that was the Democratic Party. The Republicans, they know they need the Army in Reconstruction. It gets to the point in the post-Andrew Johnson years, martial law is kind of the only solution to even gain a foothold in upholding Black civil rights. And so the Army is deployed in the South in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, but also just soldiers. The professional Army is deployed in this capacity. And all of a sudden, they're interacting with their former champions on the ground, and they're interacting with them as their conquerors. And so the Army's old friend, the Democratic Party, becomes their newest enemy. And so, quite ironically, in the 1870s, when you go to Congress, nobody is really willing to defend the Army because the Democrats who have returned from the South and the Republicans who are already suspicious of the Army agree on one thing: they don't like the Army very much. And so the Army shrinks and shrinks and shrinks into the 1870s. And then, in the kind of closing era of the Indian Wars, as those conflicts kind of subsequently come to a close, the Army kind of fades into obscurity. And there's a couple of reasons for this. They don't really have any champions, but they also don't really have a job to do. The quote unquote closing of the frontier is really the end of an era for the American Army. The closing of the frontier also aligns with the rise of an interest in naval and sea power with Alfred Thayer Mahan's sort of treatise on the importance of a Navy. And so the Navy begins to ascend and the Army begins to shrink, and it really kind of turns inward. It tries to professionalize, but by the turn of the 20th century, the professional Army is really a husk of its former self because of the kind of political forces that were exerted upon it in the post-Reconstruction period.
So Greg in the audience asks, after the Civil War, to what extent were veteran pensions and support for survivors a significant claim on public finances and a source of political conflict, especially considering the exclusion of former Confederate soldiers?
Yeah, so former Confederates would have received pensions from their state. So until very recently, the state of Virginia was still paying a Civil War pension to a child of a Civil War soldier. They are more than half of the federal budget by the turn of the 20th century. But again, if you really go into the numbers, you'll see very quickly that pensions for volunteers go up and up and up, kind of with the cost of living, because of advocates like John Logan and the Grand Army of the Republic, which is one of the largest and first lobbying organizations in American history. Professional soldiers, when they go up to ask for greater pensions for their service in conflicts such as the Indian Wars, those pleas really fall on deaf ears. Their pensions never reach more than a third of what volunteer Civil War soldiers are being paid. They are just not viewed as important. And so while pensions are a significant part of that budget and of the federal kind of outlay year in and year out, there's a vast difference between what a volunteer is being paid and what a former professional soldier is being paid. And again, this is really funny because you'd think it shouldn't matter what conflict you served in, but there's this weird phenomenon through the First World War of Congress debating pensions on the merits of the war itself and not simply the fact of military service. It's something I'd really like to write more about in the future.
And I'd like to read more about that. That's fascinating. How did the Army's relationship with Congress and the president differ from the relationship with territorial government in the West?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the Army is at the mercy of Congress. So their size and their budget is set for them. But they're also facing the fact that in the West, where the federal government has kind of uneven power, of course, territorial governments are appointed by the president. They're facing the fact that territorial governors really like to cry wolf when it comes to military crises. And so you'll get the governor of Montana or New Mexico or Colorado saying, there's an Indian invasion on the border and our people are under threat. I need to call out a militia because the regular army simply isn't doing a good enough job. So territorial governors accuse the army of not doing its job. They then call out a territorial militia, which is a way to make a quick buck if you're a territorial governor. It's basically a way to get a bunch of money into your coffers because the federal government has to repay you for that service. And so they make up an Indian crisis. They say the regular army can't respond. They call out a territorial militia. It's almost always a fiasco. They ride out for 4 days on 3 horses with 2 guns. They don't find any Indians. They come home and they stick the government with $100,000 bill, and the government pays it and then says, "Where were you?" to the army officer in the area, who says, "Well, you gave me 4 men and a boat, so I can't do anything to get to these crises." And Congress says, "I don't know what you're talking about. That's not my problem. Get it figured out." And it repeats, sort of rinse and repeat every single year until the end of the Indian Wars. So this is kind of the cycle that occurs. And William Tecumseh Sherman was seldom shy with the things he wrote down. That is why I love him. He told you exactly what he thought. You never have to wonder when you're reading a letter from William Tecumseh Sherman, gee, I wonder what William Tecumseh Sherman thought about this. He told you. You can hear him rolling his eyes at these governors because he's like, of course they don't have, of course there's not an Indian invasion. There's an Indian invasion every other week in Montana. If you listen to what these governors are saying, the Indians don't care that much. They're not kind of worried about Montana. And so it's just to the endless frustration of these officers. But I think that's why they really turn inward. They're just kind of like, look, we have no friends. We're getting it from all sides. Nobody likes us. Let's just kind of circle the wagons and wait until a period in which the country kind of needs us again, because the more we stick our necks out and the more we advocate for ourselves, which they did try to do for a while, the worse they seem to get it. And so they just kind of stop.
Yeah, it seems like, throughout the American West, no territory, no state encapsulates some of that tension that you're talking about, that you go through in your book, between calls by settlers for protection versus the needs of reconstruction than Texas. If you want to say a few words, especially since you're in Texas, how did politicians really approach that situation, and how did they address that situation in Texas?
Yeah, they used the army as their sort of ultimate bargaining chip. In Texas, the army has several jobs. Texas was a Confederate state. There's a significant enslaved population. Reconstruction has to happen, mostly here in East Texas, where I am sort of right now. Like Dallas was about the extent of course, slavery's expansion in the state. Then you have this western frontier in Texas where you still have like frequent raiding by Apache and Comanche in the kind of twilight of the Southern Plains, sort of Indian era. And so you have both of these things going on. And a favorite tactic of Texas governors was to say, if they didn't like something that was going on in Reconstruction, if they didn't like the way the army was enforcing a new law, or they wanted to get the army out of the way when, for instance, it was going to be an election and they didn't want troops to protect the polls so that they could deny Black voters entrance and so on, which is what the army was there to do, is to make sure that Black folks could vote. They would say, oh, there's a Comanche invasion. You got to send all your troops out that way. This is why. So I long wondered why Philip Sheridan ever said, I mean, apart from just general opinion on Texas, I can understand why he would say this, but Philip Sheridan is the Army officer who's in charge of this area of the country of Louisiana and Texas, which were problem spots. And it is in reference to the fact that these governors use the Army to play politics that Sheridan says, if I owned hell in Texas, I'd live in hell and rent out Texas. That's why he says it. He says it in reference to these games that these governors like to play, using the Army as a way to get their kind of political ambition in place. And so, yeah, there's a whole chapter on Texas. Sort of, I went round and round with folks about whether I had to do it, and it turned out in the end I did. But I promise, I will move on to greener pastures, quite literally, and stop inflicting the Lone Star State on folks.
I was glad that you had that in there. You do go into how use of the Army in enforcing Reconstruction resulted in former Confederates and Democrats in Congress in the 1870s. That they essentially would feel or felt about the Army, not unlike how the Republicans did about them before the war. But to some extent, there's a shift that happens after General Custer's disastrous last stand. At least in reading your book, that felt to me like you were signaling that's a pivot point. So what was the turning point here? How did Congress react to that? And how did that set the course for a more pro-military political culture moving forward?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that was I don't think the Republicans could have been more annoyed at George Custer. I mean, people were generally annoyed by George Custer all the time because of who he was, but getting himself killed right before the national centennial birthday, in a very sort of fantastical fashion, and that news hitting the Eastern papers just before the 4th of July. It was really great because Congress had passed in 1876 a huge reduction to the Army. They were going to knock another 6 regiments off, and they were thrilled. They were like, we are finally getting the Army under 20,000 men. Then Custer has his little debacle, and they have to raise the Army by 4 regiments as a response. Otherwise, it would have looked pretty bad, like they didn't care what was going on out in the West. And so the Custer moment, and Custer was a Democrat, which it didn't help Republican feeling, and an avowed Democrat. He'd been on the swing around the circle campaign with Andrew Johnson. They have to increase the Army. And they do so begrudgingly. And you can tell in the congressional speeches about the Custer disaster that they are through their teeth eulogizing this guy who has undone all their plans to finally reduce the Army to this like tiny number. And they do get it back down in the subsequent years, but it takes them a little longer than they'd like. What I really use the kind of Custer incident to show is it's the point at which I think the American public, and certainly American popular culture, becomes deeply interested in the story of the Army of the West. It's one of those like black holes in history that just draws people in, and people become obsessed by the Custer story, and it becomes such a sort of popular cultural flashpoint, first in art and then dime novels and then in films. Some of the earliest movies ever made are depictions of the Little Bighorn fight. And so I conclude the book with the story of Custer and this moment where the Army has to be briefly increased to the begrudging kind of annoyance of Congress as a way of saying it makes a lot of sense that most of us do not picture the 19th century as a period of anti-militarism, because our popular culture venerates the Army's role in the expansion of the American West and makes it seem like they're the great heroes of the era. But if you actually go into the primary sources to read what they were debating, the Army's story was much more complicated and complex, of course, than cinema and novels make it out to be. We think of the Army as the primary character in this story of Western expansion, and they are. But what I hope my book can do is show people how contested that entire process was, and how much the politics of what the military could and could not do shaped discourse about all kinds of issues in the 19th century, from slavery to civil war and the reconstruction of the country afterward.
Great. Thank you, Cecily. We have a lot of questions now. They're coming in. So Melvin had a question about how the U.S. Army went from under 20,000 men at the outset to over 500,000 during the Civil War.
Yeah, so 16,000 at the outset, 25,000 at the end of the war, and then in 1866, with Reconstruction looming, they actually raised the size of the Army to 50,000 for that 1866-1867 year. And then they started to knock off troops pretty systematically. I argue that really by 1872, they'd reduced troops in the South so significantly that the Army really couldn't actually enforce Reconstruction policy. So Reconstruction ends in 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, but I think as a practical matter, as a matter of enforceability, there's only 8,000 troops left across the entire Confederacy by 1872. That's not really enough troops to do what needs to be done in terms of enforcing Reconstruction. So they do set it at 50,000 in 1866 and then begin as quickly as they can to knock off those numbers. And those numbers are not redistributed elsewhere. It's not like a geographic realignment. It is cuts. It is cuts straight down the middle. And there's several ways in which that increase is made. And one of the most important ones, and one that stays despite the Army's reduction, is in that 1866 bill, for the first time, 4 regiments of African-American soldiers are made an official and permanent part of the United States military.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if Melvin was also asking about the full size of the Army, but one thing that we didn't touch on earlier is that, and you do go into this in your book, the volunteer portion of the Army grows exponentially during the Civil War. But even though some still have time on their 3-year, volunteer agreement to serve, the volunteer portion of the Army doesn't particularly enjoy sticking around for service in the American West or in Reconstruction. They tend to desert at high numbers and things like that too, right?
And they want to go home. I mean, they basically, they just like stop marching. They're like, no, the war's over. I don't see Robert E. Lee out here. I'm going.
Yeah. All right. So our next question is from an attendee who asked, George Washington warned about the danger of foreign entanglements. Americans did not see themselves as imperialists using the military to dominate other countries in the early days of the Republic. At what point after the Civil War did Americans begin to embrace imperialism, using the threat of military power to impose their will on other nations? How might the success of the Army in the Civil War have contributed to that change of opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a sort of multifaceted answer. I think America becomes imperialist really with the rise of the Navy. America, in order to get anywhere else, you got to go by boat. So the Navy is actually going to be the driving force around the turn of the 20th century. But there's an important reason why Americans in the 19th century did not view themselves as imperialist. And it is a particular kind of memory tradition. So all of you think and about the Civil War all the time. Nobody watching this doesn't think about Civil War memory. There's also a memory of imperialism in this country, which creates a narrative that the West was a pristine space into which Americans sort of moved without any kind of conflict. And so Americans in the 19th century who believed in manifest destiny and believed it was their destiny to settle the continent believed it was a victimless process. And so they wrote the Army out of their memory of that process as well. And so continental imperialism, the ways in which the American people settled the American West, 19th century people did not think about that as a violent settler colonial process. They thought about it as their destiny and that there were no victims kind of inherent in that process. And so it's really only when you get to overseas expansion that they have to start looking in the mirror and saying, are we like Europe? Are we like the British and the French and the Dutch? Are we the problem? But it is the Navy that I think really actually gives them the ability to do that. And the Army doesn't really ever feel like it's the front line of that imperial force. It's really, they're following in the wake of the Navy in particular. Yeah.
So that's a great segue to a question we have from Barbara, who wants to know, what was the Army doing regarding battles with Native American tribes during the Civil War, the Indian Wars during the Civil War?
Yeah, it was a deep frustration to them that Native peoples noticed that all of a sudden the Army wasn't around to stop them from doing the things that the Army had stopped them from doing in the years prior to the Civil War. And there is a regression of the quote unquote frontier as a result. The frontier settlement line actually falls back miles and miles in certain places. And there are sort of struggles and fights against Native people as they try to reassert control over the West. And you've got a 16,000-man army that's been in the West, and suddenly there's a vacuum of power because they all get pulled to the East to fight in the Civil War. Native peoples notice and they try to retake land that had previously been theirs. And the most famous example is in the Dakota War of 1862, which is a massive headache for Abraham Lincoln. I'm working on an article on that conflict right now and trying to go through it, but it's very clear to me that it's a frustration for Lincoln and for the federal government. And what actually happens in Minnesota in microcosm, this is a great illustration, is that the governor, Alexander Ramsey, says, I cannot send you troops to meet your call for 300,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. I need to redirect those volunteers to fight against the Sioux to quash this rebellion. And Lincoln says, fine, but you're going to be penalized because I actually need the troops in the Civil War more than you need them to fight the Indian Wars. So it becomes a matter of limited and finite resources. And it's really interesting. Lincoln in that moment is putting the Civil War and the defeat of the rebels ahead of this kind of crisis on the Minnesota frontier, which may have resulted in as many as 800 white settlers dying in the state of Minnesota.
I'm going to combine the next two questions a little bit from Jim and from Mary. Jim's asks, did Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's success, despite military experience, support anti-militaristic sentiment? I think we could talk about like broadly volunteer successes versus professional army successes. And then Mary wants to know, what about Ulysses S. Grant during this time? And as president, did he ever comment on the usefulness, need of professional army, or was he himself volunteer oriented?
That's two great questions. Yeah, every Chamberlain and every Logan is evidence in the Republican quiver that you don't need a professional army. And the fact that Logan and Chamberlain, these guys also aren't shy about writing memoirs, sometimes multiple memoirs, hundreds and hundreds of memoirs about how great they are. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain single-handedly saved the Union at Gettysburg by the end of his life in his final version of the fight on the Round Tops, right? And so yeah, those guys are really important in elevating the volunteer above the professional soldier. The professional soldiers who serve in the Civil War kind of can't write their memoirs right away because they're doing a whole thing called still being in the army and having to do their jobs. And so they're also delayed in writing about the conflict. So the volunteer narratives get out first as well. The question of Ulysses S. Grant, I love this one. I talk about it in the book. I think one of the great disappointments in William Tecumseh Sherman's life is that he believed when Grant became president, the army would finally have a friend in the White House. And Grant turned his back on the army and took the side of his Republican advisors. And this is really the story of Grant's presidency and the tragedy of his presidency. He felt so inexperienced at politics, he tended to listen to politicians instead of following kind of his own instincts, which had led him to such great success on the battlefield. And that's the reason historians struggle with Grant and his presidency so much. But he does turn his back on the army and he does not advocate for them as president. And Sherman says something to the effect of, when he asks for my friendship now, he may find it's not so great as it once was. It really, it kills Sherman that Grant is not the friend he should have been to the army.
Diane notes that after the Civil War, a significant number of veterans migrated to Australia. What percentage of these were professional army soldiers and how many were from the volunteer army, if you know?
I don't know, but I do know that lots of former Confederates who had been professional, who had been officers before the war, go to Egypt because they can't get their old jobs in the U.S. Army back, but some of these foreign armies will offer them jobs because they're experienced professional officers. So a good number of Confederates go to Egypt, and Wayne Shaw has written about them. But Australia, I do not know, but I would love to know. There is a great book by a scholar named Verity McGinnis that compares the experiences of the British Army in India and the American professional army in the West as two different colonizing armies for folks who are interested in that. And she looks in particular at army wives and spouses and the role of women in that process as well. So there are scholars who do work on that, and I commend it sort of immensely. It's great work.
Excellent. So we have 3 questions left. I know that we're getting really short on time. 2 of them are nearly identical, so I want to make sure we leave time for that. But one attendee commented that so much of the West was stolen from Mexico. And so if you have a comment on that, I want to give you time for that. And Lee asks, did the Army get sent to Alaska after 1867 and America's movement to acquire territories? So if you want to comment on Mexico and Alaska.
Yeah,
and then we'll get to the final question.
Sure. I'm with Grant there, right? He called it the most wicked war ever waged by one nation against another. I mean, everyone saw that for what it was. William Tecumseh Sherman, and I know I talk about him a lot, but he's endlessly sort of good for this kind of stuff. Every single year in his report, when he is general of the army, he suggests giving New Mexico back to Mexico. He's frequently like, it's sort of our equivalent of Siberia. What if we just gave it back and it wasn't our problem anymore? And at a certain point, I think they must have just rolled their eyes, but it amused me every time. He just never quite let it go. And they did, yes, they did send troops to Alaska. I remember the first time I saw, the Army publishes a report every year. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. It has a list of every deployment where every single troop goes. And I remember in about 1872, for the first time, I saw that for some reason we had 47 guys in Alaska. And I was like, okay, there we go. That's absolutely phenomenal. I will say, I would love to know more about the Alaska story, but I know that my good friend and wonderful scholar, Ruth Lawler at Cornell, is going to write her next book about Alaska and US militarization from the frontier period to the present. So it's going to be a few years here, but please do check out Ruth's work in that regard. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. She is Irish. She loves the United States. She teaches at Cornell and she's obsessed with Alaska. And it's just going to be a phenomenal book. So keep an eye out.
Well, look forward to that. So the two questions we got here are that people would love to hear a few of the ideas that are going into your next book on Lincoln and the West. People just want a short preview. So if you could give us that. And then also, thank you so much, Cecily, for providing the discount code for your book. A few folks have asked how long that's good for.
It should be good in perpetuity. It's my author discount code, so it should be all right. And LSU frequently does actually just have 40% off sales of its whole catalog. So, but it should work for my book. If you're waiting for payday or what have you, at the end of the month. So it should still be good. Lincoln in the West. Yeah. I would also love to know what's going to be in that book, since I did sign a contract to write it. So I'm really interested, as we were talking earlier, Aaron, I think of this idea that we view Lincoln as the great Western president. And he was in his own time called a Westerner, and he is in our time associated with the log cabin presidency in the West. And much of his presidency did portend to why the West was going to matter for the nation going forward, a future, of course, Lincoln did not live to see. But one of the things I'm really interested in exploring in the book is, what did it mean to a Civil War era American to call someone a Westerner? In the ways it was positive, in the ways it was pejorative, and what does it mean to actually think about Lincoln as a Westerner? And sort of situated in the West writ large. And so I think that's how the book's going to kind of open. And then I'm going to explore Lincoln's relationship with indigenous peoples. This is a tough topic. We think about Lincoln as the great emancipator. Lincoln's ideas about Native peoples were not nearly so progressive. It's a tough topic. It leads us to be slightly disappointed in Lincoln, which is an unfamiliar feeling for many Americans, right? But I think it's important to really examine why Lincoln felt this way. Of course, Lincoln serves in an Indian war. He's in the militia in the Black Hawk War. He has experience of these things. So Lincoln is frontiersman, Lincoln and Native peoples. These 1862 pieces of legislation that are so important to transforming the West. What was Lincoln's role in the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act? And then how did Lincoln think about the West as a space and its resources? He was actually way more interested in these things than we've really ever explored as historians. Lincoln, as many of you, some of you probably know, signs the legislation that creates Yosemite into law. Lincoln creates one of the first national parks, and he'd only ever seen pictures of it, right? He never actually got to see it sort of in all of its grandeur. And so I'm really interested in how Lincoln comes to view the West, even though he never got to visit it. So lots of those things. I've promised delivery of the manuscript in summer 2026, so I hope we don't have to wait too terribly long, but it's a few years in the offing still. But Liverite's going to do a great job with it, and I'm really excited to be doing the book with them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cecily. This was a fantastic conversation, and really looking forward to your next book as well. So thanks again for joining us this evening. Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Cecily, for discussions tonight on your book, The Army Under Fire. I am really personally looking forward to reading your next book, so I can't wait for it to come out. Next up, please join us on Thursday, February 6th, for a great conversation with author Dr. Jonathan White on his latest book, A Great and Good Man, Rare Firsthand Accounts and Observations of Abraham Lincoln. White will also be sharing insight on his latest children's book, At the White House with President Lincoln. In addition to Dr. White's program in February, we also have some great programs scheduled for March, April, and May. So please be sure and visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and register soon. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you for taking just a quick moment to complete a survey. And as always, thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in February. Good night.